Elizabeth I was England's greatest queen. She was strong-willed, passionate and brave.
Prepare the country for invasion.
But beneath the image of a magnificent ruler was a vulnerable woman surrounded by danger.
She had enemies everywhere, scheming for her crown and plotting against her life.
She would never know a moment's peace.
There are reports of a new plot to take your throne.
From the minute Elizabeth was born, she was thrust into a bloody game in which the stakes were life and death.
She never knew who to trust and who to fear. Her whole reign was a battle for survival.
No!
We'll see England's greatest queen as she's never been seen before.
Oh, know your place, man.
Battling threats at every turn from her father, her nobles and her sister.
She acts like your enemy and is to be feared.
Bring her here immediately.
We'll also reveal what drove her enemies, the plots they hatched, the risks they took, and show just how close they got to destroying the woman who became Elizabeth.
Go!
At 25, Elizabeth is queen, but she is far from safe.
We need to act quickly, or we are lost.
Abroad, the Pope makes Elizabeth public enemy #1.
All known Catholics should be brought in for questioning.
And at home, her ambitious cousin turns deadly.
How dare she waste my time?
As she tries to snatch Elizabeth's throne.
He's now no more than my worst enemy.
My lords, make way for Her Majesty Elizabeth, Queen of England, Wales and Ireland.
In 1559, Elizabeth Tudor, the 25-year-old daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was crowned queen. But Elizabeth's path to power had been one long battle. Her mother had been beheaded. Her father declared her a bastard. And her sister Mary imprisoned her in the Tower.
I cannot bear to look at you.
Elizabeth had survived, but she could never drop her guard.
As the young queen began her reign, bloody war was raging across Europe. Protestants and Catholics were tearing each other apart in the name of God. And the new Protestant Queen Elizabeth was instantly plunged into the middle of the battle.
Elizabeth was the most high-profile Protestant monarch in Europe, and her country was surrounded by powerful Catholic neighbours.
Members of your parliament wish to speak with you.
Her ministers believed there was one way for Elizabeth to make herself safe. Forge an alliance by marrying a Protestant king and give England an heir.
Your Majesty, I have a petition from your government. We believe it would be best for you and your entire realm if you were to choose a husband.
I would be perfectly content if one day a marble tombstone declares that a queen lived and died a virgin. I am already bound unto a husband, which is the Kingdom of England.
You can see why her ministers were so worked up. Saying she was married to the country sounded fantastic, but it was just words.
But your Majesty...
I assure you I will deal with your request in convenient time. This realm shall not remain destitute of an heir. But love is usually the offspring of leisure, and I am so busy with my duties I cannot even think of love.
Yes, your Majesty.
If that is all, good day, sir. Good day, sir.
The Queen had a very good reason for not wanting to wed.
Elizabeth knew that marrying would immediately reduce her power, as her husband would take over. She wanted to be a real queen, not a queen in name only.
Elizabeth's reluctance to marry and produce an heir was understandable, but it left a huge problem. Who would rule if she were suddenly to die?
Power-hungry nobles started to circle, each desperate to be named her heir. The most dangerous of them all
Taita. Full.
was Elizabeth's beautiful and ambitious 18-year-old Catholic cousin,
Taita.
Mary, Queen of Scots.
Full.
Mary was the only child of King James V of Scotland and his French wife, Mary of Guise. When she was just 6 days old, her father died, and Mary became queen. At the age of 5, she was sent to live in France, where she eventually married the future king, but when he died, she returned to Scotland to reclaim her throne there.
Once on the Scottish throne, Mary turned her eye to a far bigger prize. She wanted to be named Elizabeth's heir.
Now, Mary and Elizabeth were both descended from the first Tudor king, Henry VII, so Mary had a pretty good claim, and she knew it. In 1561, she sent an ambassador to Elizabeth asking to be named as heir, but Elizabeth said no.
Elizabeth's rejection would have terrible consequences that would last over 20 years.
So why did Elizabeth refuse to name Mary as her heir? After all, she was family and her claim was a strong one. Well, it all came down to religion. Elizabeth was a Protestant, Mary a Catholic. That meant if Elizabeth named Mary as her heir, England would return to Catholicism and Protestants across the land would be persecuted. Nobody, least of all Elizabeth, wanted that.
But Mary was utterly outraged by Elizabeth's brush-off. She believed adamantly that she should be named the Queen's heir. If Elizabeth wouldn't give the crown freely, Mary swore to take it by force. In 1561, Mary, Queen of Scots, issued Queen Elizabeth with a brutal warning. Unless she was named Elizabeth's heir, she would marry a European Catholic prince and take the English throne by force.
Elizabeth and her ever-faithful advisor, William Cecil, were horrified by Mary's threats.
How dare she? I will regard any such marriage as a hostile act. How do we stop her?
Your Majesty, I, like you, am concerned, but I see no clear answer, except...
Go on.
You, yourself, take a husband, and with time, produce a son, an heir. That would be the answer to all our prayers.
Cecil, you are as bad as the damn politicians.
Your Majesty, consider...
Silence. What if we were to tell my sister Queen that we would consider her place as heir if, in return, she scrapped her plans to marry a foreign prince and married an English noble?
Would you make such an offer?
I may.
Your Majesty.
Elizabeth's idea was a risk. It meant that if she died without producing a natural heir, Mary would be Queen of England. But if she could choose Mary's husband for her, an English Protestant whom she could control, she could stop England from falling back into Catholicism. One man was perfect for the job, Robert Dudley.
I'm very jealous.
Dudley was handsome and charming, and he loved Elizabeth.
thinking? Don't tease me, Your Grace.
Elizabeth and Dudley clearly adored each other, and yet Elizabeth knew that she could never marry him. For a start, Dudley already had a wife. Secondly, when in 1560 his wife died in mysterious circumstances, Dudley was implicated in her murder. The scandal was too big to ignore. Still, if Elizabeth couldn't marry him, maybe Mary could.
At first, Mary was reluctant to marry one of Elizabeth's cast-offs. But if marrying Dudley guaranteed her place as heir, she was in.
In November 1564, English and Scottish envoys met to discuss the terms of the marriage. Instead of concrete promises to trade the Dudley marriage for a claim to the crown, Elizabeth's people mumbled their way through a pathetically watered-down deal. The whole thing stank.
When Scottish ambassadors told Mary that Elizabeth refused to guarantee her place as heir, she was furious.
How dare she waste my time? She has abused me. This is a mistake, it will be her loss. I will not trust her from this day forward.
Mary felt totally betrayed. She swore to find her own husband, and together they'd snatch Elizabeth's crown. In late 1564, a noble called Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, arrived at Mary's court in Edinburgh. Darnley was a descendant of Scottish nobility, and most importantly, he, like Mary, was Catholic.
Your Majesty,
My lord, you are most welcome at court.
would you do me the great honor of dancing with me?
Mary saw Darnley as perfect marriage material. Not only was he a Catholic, he was also a grandson of Margaret Tudor, so royal blood surged through his veins. Now, Mary fancied her chances of bulldozing her way to the English throne, with another Tudor descendant by her side.
Elizabeth saw Mary's choice of husband as an aggressive personal attack. She knew that a Catholic couple on the throne of Scotland would attract the support of her enemies in Europe.
This romance must not be allowed to continue. Order Darnley to return to court immediately.
I fear the horse may have already bolted, Your Majesty. He says he's quite well where he is.
Treacherous swine! How did this happen? Send an envoy to Scotland. Tell my cousin she can have her pick of any English nobleman. If she refuses, all goodwill and kindness ends immediately.
Yes, Your Majesty.
But Mary refused to trust Elizabeth again. On July the 29th, 1565, she married Darnley. The Catholic royal couple were passionately in love, and now a credible alternative to Elizabeth's Protestant rule. And they were just north of her border.
In August 1565, Elizabeth was given the bad news.
Madam, the Scottish Queen has married Lord Darnley.
My cousin forgets herself. She's now no more than my worst enemy. How could she?
Your Majesty, rumor has it she has named Darnley king.
Fie! give him the authority to do anything!
Fortunately for Elizabeth, Mary's marital bliss didn't last long. Within weeks of the wedding, Darnley revealed exactly the kind of man he was. A drunk, arrogant, sexual deviant. Mary had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late. Queen Mary was already pregnant. On June the 19th, 1566, Mary went into labour. To her absolute delight, she gave birth to a healthy boy.
Look at you. You're so strong. Little James. You are the prince who will one day inherit the crown of England and Scotland.
Mary had done what Elizabeth had failed to do, given her country an heir. James was now another threat to Elizabeth's crown. He was a king in waiting.
But just as all seemed lost for Elizabeth, news arrived from Scotland which changed everything. On the 10th of February 1567, Darnley's body was found in an orchard in Edinburgh. He'd been strangled. It didn't take long for the name of his murderer to be revealed.
James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was a violent and jealous thug. And rumour had it, he was also Mary, Queen of Scots' lover.
When Elizabeth heard that Mary was linked to Darnley's murder, she was disgusted. But she saw a way that she could use it to her political gain. She wrote her cousin a letter. This is a copy of the actual letter, and it begins, "My ears are so deafened, and my understanding so grieved, and my heart so affrighted by this horrible news of the abominable murder of your late husband and my killed cousin." And further down she says, "I exhort you, and I counsel you, and I beseech you to take this thing so much to heart that you will not fear to touch even the closest to you if it concerns him." Elizabeth is telling Mary that she needs to bring Bothwell to justice if she wants the world to think that she is innocent of the crime. Elizabeth is warning her that this is going to be incredibly damaging to her honour and reputation, and that she needs to act carefully if she doesn't want to fall from the rank of royalty. Elizabeth sounds concerned, but I wonder if there wasn't a part of her that wasn't enjoying every minute of this.
Mary denied any part in Darnley's murder, but nobody believed her. On April the 24th, 1567, Mary and Bothwell were forced to run to Dunbar Castle in East Lothian. At first, people believed Mary had been abducted. But news soon reached Elizabeth that she had married her husband's suspected killer.
You asked to see me, Your Majesty.
How could a worse choice be made for her honour than to marry such a man? A man charged with the murder of her own husband.
Scotland is a quagmire. It is said she has given Bothwell more land and titles than she ever gave her husband.
No friend in the world could like this marriage.
We must do everything in our power to punish the murderer.
Elizabeth was now determined to bring Bothwell and her murderous cousin Mary to justice, once and for all. In April 1567, 34-year-old Queen Elizabeth was still unmarried. Her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, had recently wed for the third time to Lord Bothwell, the man accused of murdering Mary's second husband.
Mary's increasingly bizarre marriages were starting to make Elizabeth's decision to stay single look pretty sensible. Scottish nobles were outraged at Darnley's murder, and they put troops in the streets to bring the killers to justice. Bothwell fled, but Mary, now pregnant again, surrendered. Mary handed her infant son, Prince James, over to her captors. Then she was marched through the streets of Edinburgh in disgrace. As she walked, people shouted out, "Burn the whore, burn the murderess." They spat, and they held up placards showing her as a mermaid, the symbol of a prostitute and an adulteress.
On June the 17th, 1567, Mary was imprisoned here at the remote Loch Leven Castle in Kinross, Perthshire.
Mary being locked up sounds like the sort of thing that Elizabeth would have loved. After all, her cousin had been sniffing around her throne for years. Having a rival and an enemy like that kept quiet would have surely been a good thing. But there was a problem. Mary was a queen, and to Elizabeth that really mattered. Because if Scottish nobles had dared to lock up Mary, what was to stop English nobles doing the same to Elizabeth?
But despite her concern, Elizabeth refused to rescue her fellow queen. She knew if she did, it could start a vicious war with Scotland.
Mary soon fell seriously ill. In early July, she had a miscarriage. She'd been carrying twins. Mary's position was desperate, but she had further to fall. On July the 24th, 1567, Scottish nobles eager to seize power gave her a brutal ultimatum.
What is this?
It is the decision of the Council that you are so exhausted in body, mind and spirit by the responsibilities of government that you can no longer rule.
How dare you? I'm your queen.
You will abdicate in favour of your son James. A regent will be appointed until he reaches the age of maturity.
What? No. I refuse to sign.
Sign the deed.
Never.
Sign. Or I will cut your throat from ear to ear.
When God sets me free, I will not abide by this.
for this was done against my will.
Days later, Mary's one-year-old son, James, was crowned King of Scotland. But Mary was to fight back. On May the 2nd, 1568, Mary convinced a young lad called Little Willie to row her across this loch. She was determined to win her throne back. The problem was, apart from Little Willie, she barely had 2 friends in Scotland to rub together. In fact, there was only one person she knew who had the power to put her back where she thought she belonged: Elizabeth. Mary's escape plan worked, and 2 weeks later she arrived in England.
But if Mary thought Queen Elizabeth would welcome her with open arms, she was seriously deluded.
Where is she now?
Cumberland. She asks your grace for an audience.
We must help her the best that we can.
Your Majesty, with respect, it would be foolishness to help a queen who has schemed and plotted against you for so many years.
Her arrival in England was not merely inconvenient. It was exactly the thing that Elizabeth and her councillors had feared since the beginning of her reign. Across Europe, Catholics and Protestants were slaughtering each other. Until now, Elizabeth had managed to keep the Catholics in her kingdom under control. But the arrival of Mary meant that they had a figurehead around whom to rally.
Your Grace, we cannot let her roam freely in England. She would be an inspiration to any Catholic rebel in your kingdom and beyond.
Then she must remain as our guest. Not in a prison, but neither free. She must be kept under constant watch. See to it.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Mary was immediately arrested and held in Carlisle Castle.
Elizabeth was right to keep Mary under lock and key. A full-scale Catholic rebellion was about to explode.
And the man behind that rebellion was Elizabeth's most formidable enemy yet. None other than the leader of the Catholic Church himself, Pope Pius V.
Pius V might have been God's representative on earth and the head of the church, but he wasn't really into peace and love and all of that Christian stuff. In fact, he hated the heretic Elizabeth and he wanted her dead. On the 25th of February 1570, Pius issued this, a papal bull of excommunication. That's an official letter from the Vatican casting Elizabeth out of the church forever. And he doesn't pull his punches. He starts off by describing her as the pretended Queen of England, a slave of wickedness. Not a very polite way of starting a letter to anyone, but this isn't just insults. He goes on to say, "We do declare her to be deprived of her pretended title to the kingdom, and of all dominion, dignity and privilege whatsoever." And that's very important, because this is a licence for any foreign king or prince to invade England, kick Elizabeth off the throne, and maybe even kill her. And there's more. He goes on to say that the nobility, subjects and people of England are absolved from their oath, duty, dominion, allegiance and obedience, and that anyone who disobeys him in this, we do inundate with the like sentence of anathema. Translation? People of England, if you obey your queen, you're going straight to hell.
Pope Pius was calling for a full-scale Catholic revolution. Central to his plan was Mary, Queen of Scots. He wanted to overthrow Elizabeth and put Catholic Mary on the throne of England.
The Pope's declaration meant that every Catholic in the country was now a potential enemy to Elizabeth. Cecil desperately needed his queen to see the terrible danger that she was in.
Your Majesty, we ignore this threat at your peril.
I do not want my subjects to be mistreated or questioned in matters of faith, as long as they obey the laws of this realm.
I refuse to make windows into the souls of men.
With respect, this is a mistake! All known Catholics should be brought in for questioning. If found guilty of treason, they should be punished!
No, Cecil! That is not the answer! Leave!
Cecil had every right to be terrified. There were Catholics throughout the land. To help protect the Queen, Cecil recruited Francis Walsingham. Walsingham was a devout Protestant and fiercely loyal to Elizabeth. He became her chief spy.
Walsingham made Mary the #1 enemy of the state. He wanted her dead. But there was no proof that Mary had been involved in the Pope's plot to overthrow Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. And without evidence, it would be impossible to persuade Elizabeth to execute her fellow queen.
Cecil and Walsingham couldn't kill Mary, but they could break her.
As the weeks turned to months and the months to years, conditions in Mary's cell deteriorated.
Elizabeth knew that conditions in Mary's prison were worsening by the day, and I think on a personal level this would have greatly troubled her. But she also knew that her life and England's future hung by a thread, so she tolerated Cecil's slow throttling of Mary's freedom.
By 1586, Mary had been in prison for 18 years. She was desperate to escape. That summer, her chance finally came. A letter was smuggled into Mary's prison. It was sent by a Catholic noble, Anthony Babington. These are his exact words.
My dear sovereign and queen, unto whom I owe all fidelity and obedience. I am horrified by the terrible conditions you have been kept in. The removal of your royal person from your home to the custody of a wicked heretic and my mortal enemy, Elizabeth. We undertake to deliver you from the hands of your enemy and to kill the heretic queen. There are 6 noble gentlemen, all my private friends, who for the sake of the Catholic cause and your Majesty's service will kill Queen Elizabeth.
Babington wanted Mary to give his plot her blessing.
Agreeing was a huge risk. If she was caught, it meant the executioner's block. On the other hand, what did she have left to lose? Mary thought about Babington's proposal for over a week. Eventually, she made up her mind.
Mary dictated her response to her secretary.
When the affairs are prepared and your forces are ready, then it will be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work. Once the Queen is dead, then I must be transported out this prison immediately.
The reply was written in secret code and smuggled out of the castle in a beer barrel. The plot to murder Elizabeth was on, and Catholic assassins moved in for the kill. The Queen's life was now in more danger than ever before. In the summer of 1586, Mary, Queen of Scots, gave her blessing to a Catholic plot led by Sir Anthony Babington to murder Queen Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne.
But Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, was onto the treasonous conspiracy. His spies intercepted Mary's message from prison. Walsingham now had proof that Mary was plotting to overthrow Elizabeth.
On September the 25th, 1586, Mary Queen of Scots was taken to Fotheringay Castle in the East Midlands to stand trial for her part in the Babington plot. No foreign monarch had ever been tried under English law for treason.
In October 1586, Mary was found guilty of conspiring with Babington to kill Queen Elizabeth.
The verdict could mean only one sentence, death. But Elizabeth now began agonizing over carrying out the sentence. Once again, she was torn between her desire to stamp out her enemies and her revulsion at killing a fellow queen.
On the 12th of November, Cecil and Walsingham begged Elizabeth to sign Mary's death warrant. Elizabeth now faced the biggest dilemma of her life.
Your Majesty, she is hardened against you despite all you have done for her. There can be no room for mercy.
I have never been in greater conflict with myself. I understand that my safety depends wholly on the death of another, but it brings me such sorrow to spill the blood of a fellow queen.
Majesty, both the Scottish Queen and her supporters believe she has the right not only to succeed you, but to take your crown.
What will my enemies say when it is known that to save my life I happily spilled the blood of my own cousin?
Desperate to execute Mary, her ministers tried to scare Elizabeth into signing.
Your Majesty, there are reports of a new plot to free Queen Mary and take your throne. Rumors are Spanish soldiers are amassing on the Welsh borders.
Is this true?
I believe so, Your Majesty. We need to act quickly, or we are lost.
It was all lies, designed to scare the Queen, and it worked.
On the 1st of February, 1587, after months of stalling, Elizabeth finally asked for Mary's death warrant.
Tell Walsingham I have signed.
But be clear, this is only to be used if Spain invade and attack the city.
Finally, Cecil had his hands on Mary's death sentence, and he was going to execute it, no matter what Elizabeth said.
I did not think that a queen would consent to my death. I'm quite ready and happy to die. For my Saviour and the Catholic Church.
On February the 8th, 1587, after 19 years in prison. Mary, Queen of Scots, was brought before her executioner at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire.
Your hands, Lord. I commit my spirit. Into your hands, Lord. Commit my spirit. Into your hands, Lord. I commit my spirit. Into your hands, Lord. I commit my spirit. Into your hands, Lord. I commit my spirit.
It took the executioner 3 swings to remove Mary's head.
When Elizabeth discovered that Cecil had executed Mary, she flew into a violent rage.
How dare you! I've sent my secretary to the Tower, and you are lucky not to follow.
Your Majesty, I beg to lie before your feet in the hope of soaking up your mercy.
You are a traitor, a false dissembler, a wicked wretch. This death will wring my heart for the rest of my life. I cannot bear to look at you. Get out of my sight. Get out!
Mary was never Elizabeth's brightest enemy, but even from a prison cell, she'd been one of the most dangerous. In the end, there was no choice. Mary had to die.
Mary would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. She and her ministers had killed a monarch. They had crossed a line. And just as Elizabeth had feared, there would be terrible consequences.
Next time.
I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and the stomach of a king.
Elizabeth was facing the greatest challenge of her reign.
We are like a lamb to the slaughter. We must act while we have the chance.
The Spanish Armada.
King Philip means to invade.
That would be an act of war.
The King of Spain was hell-bent on killing her.
How dare she?
And crushing Protestant England forever.
She will pay for this.
The final battle of Elizabeth's reign was beginning, and everything was at stake.
There is nothing about which I am more anxious than my country.